On June 13, 1983, it seemed like just another ordinary day in the city of Anchorage, Alaska. But that illusion shattered when a young woman, barefoot and in handcuffs, was seen desperately running through one of the main streets. People watched in shock, unable to make sense of what they were seeing. That horrifying scene would soon expose a series of grotesque and barbaric crimes, pulling back the curtain on the hidden life of a serial killer. No one could have imagined that this man was living a double life, or that he was capable of such calculated and twisted act. For more than 10 years, he carried on without being caught, moving through everyday life as if nothing was wrong. Robert Hansen was born in 1939 in the town of Estherville, Iowa. His early years were filled with difficulties. He was extremely shy, had a stutter, and his skin carried lasting scars from severe acne. Because of his short height and awkward, quiet behavior, he spent most of his school life isolated and alone. Rejected by girls and mocked by classmates, Robert turned to hunting and archery. For him, hunting was not only an escape, but also a place where he created darker thoughts, imagining ways to feel powerful against those who once hurt him. On December 7, 1960, his bottled-up anger exploded. He set fire to a school bus garage in Pocahontas County. Arrested for arson, he received a 3-year sentence and served about 20 months before being released. That same year, he had married, but while in prison, his wife filed for divorce. During his time behind bars, psychiatrists diagnosed him with serious psychological struggles. Reports described him as having manic depression and occasional schizophrenic episodes. One doctor noted that he showed signs of what was called an infantile personality disorder, a condition often marked by the urge to gain control and dominance by causing distress to others. Robert became obsessed with taking revenge on those he believed had wronged him, and this fixation would soon guide him toward a darker path. In 1963, Robert married Darla Hansen, a devoted Christian and a teacher. At first, the marriage appeared to bring stability, but Robert could not keep himself out of trouble. He continued to get caught for small thefts. Eventually, the couple moved to Anchorage, Alaska. There, Robert opened his own bakery, following his father's trade. They had 2 children and, at least on the surface, seemed to be fitting into the community. Neighbors thought of him as quiet, shy, and a little strange, but in the hunting world, Robert was admired. He set several local records, appeared in a hunting magazine, and in 1971 gained a world record with a bow. By the 1970s, Alaska was changing. The construction of the massive Trans-Alaska Pipeline attracted thousands of workers from across the country. Along with the workers came nightlife, drugs, and women seeking fast money. The city of Anchorage became a magnet for those chasing opportunity, but also for those vulnerable to danger. One of them was 17-year-old Cindy Paulson. She had come to Anchorage with her boyfriend, trying to survive. To earn money, she worked as a dancer and sold her time on the streets. She could not have known that her path would soon cross with Robert Hansen, the quiet baker hiding a much darker side. During this time, Cindy crossed paths with a small-framed man named Robert Hansen. On June 13, 1983, Robert stopped his car where Cindy was standing by the roadside. He offered her $200 to get in. Even though she knew it wasn't wise to trust a stranger, Cindy hesitated and eventually climbed into the vehicle. Almost immediately, she realized her instincts had been right. Robert pulled out a gun and forced her into handcuffs. With the threat of being shot, Cindy had no choice but to obey as Robert drove her back to his home. Once there, he chained her by the neck in the basement and subjected her to cruelty. What shocked Cindy even more was how calm and casual Robert seemed about the entire situation. He eventually fell asleep on the couch. When he woke up, he began talking as if he couldn't resist bragging, showing her many hunting trophies and souvenirs. Cindy understood right away. If he was letting her see his real name and personal possessions, it meant he didn't plan on letting her go. She knew she had to escape. The only question was when. Later, Robert forced Cindy back into the car and drove her toward Merrill Field Airport, where his small plane was kept. His plan was to fly her to a remote cabin along the Nick River. While loading supplies onto the plane, he left Cindy handcuffed in the passenger seat, warning her not to move or he would shoot. But as soon as Robert turned his back, Cindy saw her chance. She bolted from the car and ran barefoot, still in cuffs, toward the nearest road. Thinking quickly, she hid her blue sneakers in the back seat of the car as proof she had been there. Robert chased after her, waving his weapon and yelling, but just before he caught up, Cindy managed to flag down a passing truck. The stunned driver picked up the terrified young woman. Realizing his plan had fallen apart, Robert abandoned his flight and raced off in his car. A security guard at the airport didn't witness Cindy's desperate escape, but he did notice Robert speeding away and wrote down the license plate number. The truck driver tried to convince Cindy to go directly to the police, but after being held for hours under constant fear, Cindy was overwhelmed. Instead, she begged to be dropped off at the Mush Inn so she could call her boyfriend. Her boyfriend was staying at the Big Timber Motel. The driver, shaken by the sight of a barefoot girl still in handcuffs, agreed to her request. Not long after he dropped her off, he reported the encounter to police. Anchorage officers soon found Cindy at the motel, still wearing the handcuffs. She was alone and in a state of shock. Cindy explained what had happened to her. She told police that she had been abducted by Robert Hansen. She described his car, his house, and even the weapon he carried. She even pointed out the small plane he planned to use. Yet, despite all these concrete details, the police were skeptical. The reason? They knew Robert. Local officers often visited his bakery, and the quiet small man would always serve them free pastries and coffee. They genuinely liked him. So even with all the evidence right in front of them, they chose to believe him. When Cindy identified Robert, police questioned him, but Robert claimed Cindy was exaggerating, saying she was upset because he had refused to pay her after a service. His humble, shy demeanor, his small build, his image as a family man and respected hunter, all of it convinced the police that he was innocent. Because of Cindy's occupation, no one showed her empathy, and her case was closed. Sadly, crimes like the one Cindy endured weren't unusual in the area. At that time, disappearances and killings were alarmingly common. Alaska State Trooper Detective Glenn Floth was part of a team investigating a string of murders near Anchorage. The first body had been discovered by construction workers along Eklutna Road. Because her identity was never established, she became known as Eklutna Annie. Soon after, the body of Joanna Messina was found in a gravel pit. Then, a partially buried leg near the Nick River led police to the hidden remains of 23-year-old Sherry Morrow. All three victims showed similar gunshot wounds. Floth became convinced there was a serial killer operating in the region. The victims were all women working as dancers or in sex work, those most vulnerable and least protected. Realizing he needed help, Floth reached out to the FBI. To narrow down the suspects, the FBI developed a psychological profile. Agent John Douglas predicted the killer would be experienced, deeply insecure, harbor resentment toward women, and possibly have a speech disorder such as a stutter. The profiler also suggested the killer likely kept souvenirs from his victims. Using this profile, Floth compiled a list of suspects, and eventually he came across Robert and Cindy's testimony against him. Unlike the other officers, Floth had no hesitation about investigating Robert. When his home was finally searched, jewelry belonging to victims was discovered. Investigators also found a flight map hidden behind the headboard of his bed, marked with more than 20 X's. A closer look revealed that some of those marks aligned with the locations where 3 bodies had already been found. Authorities began exploring the other marked spots in the wilderness. At nearly every site, they uncovered more remains. 4 months after the attack on Cindy, Robert was finally arrested. But what emerged afterward were the shocking details of his long string of crimes. Back in December of 1971, Robert had already been arrested for 2 separate offenses: attempting to kidnap and assault a housewife and attacking a sex worker. He received a 5-year prison sentence, but he served only 6 months. By 1972, Robert had begun killing, At first, he targeted any woman who caught his attention, but he quickly realized he was living in the perfect place to carry out his dark urges. Anchorage had become a magnet for young runaways, many of them turning to sex work or exotic dancing to survive. His victims were usually between 16 and 19 years old. Robert deliberately chose women whose disappearances would likely go unnoticed and whose traces would be hard to follow. Because of his long and irregular hours at the bakery and his obsession with hunting, his wife Darla never questioned his strange absences. She had no idea about the horrific crimes her husband was committing when he wasn't home. Robert had long seen himself as a hunter. It was the part of his identity he was most proud of. That's why he viewed his victims as the ultimate prey. He would kidnap women and force them into isolated areas. Sometimes Robert would assault them and then release them, threatening to kill them if they ever went to the police. Other times, he played out the twisted fantasy he had harbored since his youth. He would release them into the wild, like around the Nick River, let them run, and then chase them down with his rifle, eventually killing them. From these sadistic, human hunts, Robert derived a disturbing sense of satisfaction and dominance. To him, the women were no different than wild animals. For more than a decade, he managed to avoid capture, earning the grim nickname the Butcher Baker during the investigation. Under intense questioning, Robert gradually began to confess to the murders one by one. In total, he admitted to killing 17 women, though only 12 bodies were ever recovered. He refused to acknowledge some of the X's on his map, insisting he wasn't responsible for certain victims found at those marked locations. Robert's twisted statements and attempts to justify his murders were deeply unsettling. He even told investigators that he only killed bad girls and would never harm good women. From his own chilling confession, Robert once revealed how he viewed women. He said, "They all became so valuable to me that I wanted their friendship. I wanted them to get along with me, but it was always on my terms." He went on to describe the disturbing way he chose his victims. He would linger in bars, watching and waiting for dancers to make the first move. To him, it was like a game. He said, "If they didn't throw the ball, I couldn't hit it." In his twisted logic, as long as the women were simply working for money, he claimed he didn't look down on them. But the moment one of them approached him with an offer, he decided she was no longer a good girl, and tragically, that meant she was marked as his next victim. Robert admitted to attacking at least 30 women and killing somewhere between 17 and 21, yet through a plea deal, he avoided facing 17 separate murder trials. Instead, he was convicted of just 4 murders. Known as the Butcher Baker, Robert Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison, plus a life sentence without the possibility of parole. During his trial, Cindy, the only woman to ever escape him, was placed in a safe house with a close friend. After the conviction, she left Anchorage, married, and eventually became the mother of 3 children. Cindy was the single victim who managed to survive his grasp, and because of her bravery, Robert was finally brought to justice. In 2014, Robert Hansen died at the age of 75 from natural health complications, closing the final chapter of one of the darkest stories in Alaska's history.